a real pleasure to help us begin with this very special event. It's actually my happy duty to introduce a colleague who will then introduce our distinguished speaker this afternoon. I should mention, as I think most of you know, this is the second in a series of 3 public lectures by our guest. And I would like to note, for the sake of the audience, that at the end of the formal lecture, we will have applause, and then we will move into a question and answer period for some period of time. It's my privilege to introduce my colleague Sarah Schneewind, an assistant professor in the history department, a specialist on the study of late imperial Chinese history. Let me tell you a little bit about Sarah, and I'll turn the proceedings over to her. Sarah studied as an undergraduate at Cornell University. She's a Phi Beta Kappa graduate of that institution. She trained for a doctorate at Columbia, and she has served on the faculties at both Columbia and at Southern Methodist University for some years before joining the UCSD faculty last year. She's the recipient of many distinguished honors. I would note that she held the Hofstadter Fellowship at Columbia University. And I noted with great pleasure that she also received a distinction in the 1997 Robert Penn Warren Poetry Prize competition, although she assures me she's given up poetry for the time being. And in 2004, Sarah was elected president of the Society for Ming Studies. Sarah's research focuses on state and society during the Ming Dynasty. She is particularly interested in examining community schooling in that era, or she has been, and she has completed a remarkable bottom-up analysis of this epoch in Chinese history, an epoch long understood conventionally from the top-down perspective. So her interventions in this regard are very significant in the literature, and I'm delighted to note that her book, Community Schools and the State in Ming China, has just been published by Stanford University Press. Assistant Professor Sarah Schneewind.
Thank you, Michael. That was all an exaggeration. My job today is a very pleasant one. On Monday, Professor Esherick spoke about Professor Wakeman's many languages, his many students, and his many, many publications. And I'm not going to repeat all the details of what Professor Esherick told you. In a sense, nearly everyone studying and teaching Chinese history in the United States is a student of Professor Wakeman, 1 or 2 generations removed. My own advisor was a classmate of Professor Esherick's under Professor Wakeman, and I'm planning to ask her for more details about his being a Hellion. I'm still trying to wrap my head around that one. Moreover, personally, I remember sitting with my back against the clock tower in Ithaca, reading The Fall of Imperial China in about 1984. I remember sitting in Star Library reading The Great Enterprise for several days. And I also remember a very vivid and wonderful lecture that Professor Wakeman gave at Yale on the Green Gang in Shanghai and the police files. Really terrific. So it's really a pleasure to hear Professor Wakeman's views on the last 1,000 years or so of Chinese history, and it's an honor to be standing here to introduce him. Frederic Wakeman Jr. is the Haas Professor of East Asian Studies at UC Berkeley, and he's taught there for about 4 decades. He's the former president of the American Historical Association and a former president of the Social Science Research Council. He appeared last night on television, I believe, on the Jim Lehrer NewsHour, talking about internet censorship in China, so now we know he's really a celebrity. And of course, he's the author of many, many books. Books, I want to point out, that in addition to having a major impact on our field, are also readable and enjoyable. I know not everyone was able to be at the lecture on Monday. Professor Wakeman spoke about the place in the long span of Chinese history of the Mongol occupation, the Yuan Dynasty, which ruled North China from 1234 and all of China, including the south, from 1276. The Yuan Dynasty fell to the Ming, the dynasty Professor Wakeman will discuss today, in about 1367, after a prolonged period of civil war, millenarian uprisings, disasters, famines, and plague. Professor Wakeman explained that there is a school of American historians who, in the balancing act all historians must do between stressing continuity and talking about change, are in his opinion putting too much emphasis on continuity. In particular, by stressing the continuity of one version of Confucianism, a version that arose in the Song called Daoshui, or Neo-Confucianism, by stressing that strain of Confucianism as the prime marker of Chinese identity, these historians follow Chinese tradition to project an image of a self-confident and even complacent Chinese culturalism. Professor Wakeman argued that this confidence was more apparent than real. In fact, he argued, the challenge of the Mongol overthrow of the Song dynasty radically changed Chinese history, institutions, and ways of thinking and acting. The caesura, or break, of the brutal Yuan occupation of China and its anti-Chinese policies broke the self-confidence of the Chinese, changed customs and social structure, and disrupted culture and history. The topic for today is Ming Nativism and the Local Turn. Professor Frederic Wakeman.
Thank you, Sarah. That was brilliantly done. I didn't realize I said all that. No, I was actually had made some notes before, just before coming here this afternoon, to sum up that precisely that position I've taken. But I don't think I could add much to what Sarah said by way of condensing and indeed refining in certain ways my remarks on Monday. I think the only thing that I might add, because it leads into more of the discussion which we'll continue today, is that there's a curious irony in this culturalism, and it's part of a special vulnerability that I will talk about a little at the end of this lecture and more on Friday, in that, in a certain sense, the Chinese literati class was hoisted on its own petard when they adopted this stance. Let me elaborate on that very, very quickly. If you go along with me and believe that the shock of the Mongol conquest, and before that, the discrepancy of the Jin conquest and the division of the empire with traditional notions of Chinese universalist rule, led to a projected renewal of supposed faith, but also of assertive faith in Chinese culture that is expressed in the Neo-Confucianism of the Song period, and that is singled out by scholars like Professor Bouff at Harvard as constituting the cultural legacy that links this long millennium together, dynasty to dynasty. Then you can understand that beneath the complacency, there shivers there trembles a kind of murmur of doubt that simply can't be altogether wished away. As Confucianists and as Chinese had to square their notions, which were not untroubled after the Sung period with their many, many Asian neighbors, that they were at the center of the known political world, and certainly at the apex of the cosmological world order that their Son of Heaven represented to them, and they thought to other peoples as well. So that there was a forced quality to this culturalism. The petard, the rocket that they found themselves sitting on top of as it took off into the future of their own history, was that by that same token, they had to admit, going back to some of the early canonical texts like the Analects, that once a stranger, once a barbarian entered the veil of civilization, they could, by imitation and by sincere mastery of the forms of Chinese ethical civilization become civilized themselves. That vulnerability meant that when a conqueror, and I'm thinking now especially of the Manchu conquerors in the 17th century, asserted the universality of their rule in Confucian terms, that the Chinese literate class more or less had to accept it, and that they found that they could not fall back on a very strong sense of ethnic identity that would have rendered them special but particularistic, and hence vulnerable to the attack that they were not accepting a universal ruler, be it Kangxi or Qianlong during the Qing, in order to preserve their own sense of ethnic separateness. This vulnerability, therefore, played right into the hands of conquest rulers, foreign rulers, who paid lip service to, and indeed in many respects by the middle of the 18th century came to believe, that they were universal sage kings by Confucian standards. So that there was a kind of tacit collusion between the Han ruling elites, we'll call them the gentry, and the ruling house, which was composed of ethnic Manchus and which was struggling hard to preserve its ethnic identity, to paper over the cultural, ethnic, religious, and other divisions between the new rulers and their new subjects. I'll come back to this at some length at the end of this lecture, and also try to explore that more, that tension on down into modern times, in fact even down into the present, when we return to the topic on Friday. Now in the lecture on Monday, I, perhaps errantly, perhaps even casually, referred to the continuists, to which Sarah alluded, as evolutionists, whose notion of Chinese history seems to be based upon moderate incremental change rather than dramatic, caesura, as she said, dramatic disruptions. The evolutionists base, and I should say that Sarah's being very generous, she comes out of the maw of the I won't say the monster, but she comes out of the maw of this school, having been a student also of Robert Himes. So I tread warily here. She's been well schooled, in other words, in these traditions that I'm casting some aspersion on now. So I'm proceeding very tenderly and very gingerly, as though across a minefield, in saying what I have to say today. The evolutionists based much of their case for continuity during the Song Yuan Ming transition, which is what they call this period from roughly 1000 to, let's say, around 1450, nearly 500 years, which we discussed in the first lecture, on the social history written by the late Robert Hartwell and his students, the most eminent of which is Robert Himes, whom I just mentioned. Robert Himes, above all, developed the thesis that during the Song period, members of the Chinese elite began to shift their orientation away from bureaucratic service in the metropolitan capital toward education and public affairs in their own locales. And this is, I haven't yet read Sarah's book, but I imagine some of that attention to the academies or the local schools during the Ming, it doesn't stem from that particular ideological ground, but is an attention paid to this kind of development locally throughout Ming China. And it's a well-deserved approach, and I'm sure an absolutely superb and will be very influential study. And then I quote from Paul Smith, who is another avatar of the Buddha, of Hartwell. Elites from the southern Ming, elites from the southern Song through the Ming were less dependent on the state than they had been during the Tang and the northern Song. For as southern elites under the southern Song came to focus on local, often lineage-oriented reforms, such as community granaries, charitable estates, and private academies, the political center of gravity that in the 11th century had resided in the centralized state shifted during the Song Yuan Ming transition to the educated, landowning local elites. This is not to say, Smith goes on, that local elites cut themselves off from the state. Rather, for the first time, those whose power and prestige were strictly local came as a group to have an impact on the politics and society of the country as a whole. And I would, parenthetically, for those of you who are who read the literature in this field, I would therefore take some issue with the recent article by Peter Bouff in Late Imperial China, which stresses the perduring and uniform nature of the Ming local elite, and which I think neglects quite a lot of Japanese scholarship to the contrary. Peter Bouff, in fact, especially emphasizes the Neo-Confucian tincture or color of their new localism, reflecting on the history of Wuzhou, which is current-day Jinhua in present-day Zhejiang. Oh, I have to break in with another parenthetical excursus. I think that Jinhua, which is a city in the mid-Qiantang River Valley, noted for its candied hams and hard candy, which its peasants peddled across the empire during the Qing period, it was originally Buzhou, and it was a center of a school of Neo-Confucianism. It was noted for its local worthies. Most of the pailo, most of the shrines and the arches and so forth have been destroyed or used by peasants to build other things since then, and there isn't a lot to see in that city, I must say, save for the bell tower and a couple of ruined temples today. But it still is there, and there still is a very strong pride of place. A friend of mine went there, I guess it was last summer. We saw them in Shanghai, yeah. A summer before this, yes, last summer. And he said that Peter Bouff's impress was everywhere. Now, Peter, I knew, had taken a summer group of, I think, mainly graduate students, but also undergraduate students from his Harvard classes to Jinhua, where he is doing a longitudinal study of this famous locale. And it was apparently, I don't know how many people actually went, but it was apparently a sort of a tremendous event locally, because everywhere you went, you heard Baobida, Peter Bouff, Baobida here, Baobida there, Baobida, and all throughout the town there were plastered scrolls, Hafodashi at Harvard University. So that I think it's sort of an offshoot of it's instead of Jinhua on the Qiantang, it's Jinhua on the Charles for the time being. In any case, reflecting on the history of Wuzhou, Peter Bouff writes that, quote, Neo-Confucianism was one of the central threads of intellectual and cultural continuity between the Song, Yuan, and Ming periods. When the teachings, conceptions, and core texts of the great Neo-Confucian scholars entered the examination curriculum in the late Southern Song and became required reading in Yuan and Ming, Neo-Confucianism became a necessary part of the shared culture of the literati, the shi, to whom I frequently refer. In what did this later localism consist? According to Professor Bouff, the Southern Song worthies of Wuzhou were from well-established local families. They had consciously decided to stop pursuing government careers. They were deeply concerned with maintaining literati standards of behavior. They shared a broad concern about political and social turmoil. They had been, quote, converted, unquote, to Neo-Confucianism to seek to extend knowledge through the investigation of things. They were devoted to teaching their students how to think and learn, and they maintained independence from political power while focusing on self-cultivation. So the image you have here is of a very autonomous group, I'll call them an estate, a stand, that was bred through the examinations, where now one had to memorize the orthodox commentaries of Zhu Xi and others from the Northern Song. And so we're steeped not just in terms of knowledge, but also in terms of social formation in this Neo-Confucianism that Professor Bouff emphasizes so strongly as constituting the thread of continuity. Therefore, the continuity that he speaks of through the Mongol conquest and the civil wars of the 14th century was primarily an intellectual tradition born of China's high culture. It was neither mainly institutional nor socioeconomic. Other scholars have argued, however, that the short-lived Yuan dynasty had a profound impact on Chinese thought. The Yuan, of course, are the Mongols. Jack Langlois, to those of you who are his friends, and John Dardess both emphasize the involvement of Yuan period literati in statecraft studies. And Langlois also stresses the change in the concerns of Wuzhou literati from Daoxue, studies of the way, to Wen, which means literature and culture. Mongol rule had an acute effect on legal institutions as well. Many changes in the Chinese law system, and I responded along these lines to Sarah's question at the last session, many changes in the Chinese law system proceeded from the Yuan dynasty into the Ming, not as a seamless continuity, but as a rupture with prior legal practices. These included, for example, the institution of hereditary soldier households, which provided a justification for keeping property in the male patriline, whereas Sung law had provided for assets to be passed to women. It provided for the legalization of forced levirate marriages that stripped widows of their autonomy and tied them more to their marital than their natal families. And the bolstering of the power of the lineage by countenancing private corporate ownership of land to a degree under the Ming was never enjoyed by rural elites during the Tang and Song. Moreover, the founder of the Ming Dynasty, the Hongwu Emperor, was not only an ardent nativist who believed that the Mongols were a disease of the viscera and not just the skin of the body politic, he was also determined to destroy the social base of the great families of Jiangnan, the Yangtze Delta, who had supported his rival Zhang Shicheng during the civil wars and strife of the 1350s and 1360s. The local gentry of Suzhou especially aroused his ire, and tens of thousands of these lineages were transported to savage regions in the southwest to people the frontiers and open up new land. He shared his animus toward the notables of the Yangtze Delta with his son, the Yongle Emperor, who, of course, usurped the throne from his nephew, who forcibly resettled tens of thousands more in the plains around Beijing, which became Yongle's northern capital after 1421. And going back to the Hongwu Emperor, or Ming Taizu, and from the very beginning of his reign, the Hongwu Emperor, whose years as a Buddhist mendicant, a chigai literally, a beggar with a begging bowl, had left him with a profound dislike of local elites, was determined to replace the formal personnel of district administration and the informal mediating mechanisms of the southern Sung gentry with a minimalist form of local government that would rely upon new rural elites to serve as the dynasty's tax collectors without recourse to official administrators. These tax chiefs, or liangzhang, were self-providing, supposedly honored by the privilege to appear in person at the court in Nanjing to deliver their charges, their tribute taxes, in person. They also were given the privilege of riding a horse in the capital and even on the palace grounds in some cases. What I'm describing here, in other words, is a conscious policy to do away with local rural gentry, that is of what we would consider to be gentry elite status, and rely instead upon well-to-do freeholders or rich peasants, men of, I say men because women couldn't serve in the capacity, men as of local economic means who could be sent out or who would go out themselves and on behalf of the central government collect the taxes that were then, this was a period of time when taxes were paid in kind, not in cash, would take the taxes, the tribute grain, in person to the capital, then in Nanjing, and handed over to the officials of the Ministry of Finance for their district. And for that they were, as I say, allowed certain privileges that singled them out from their peers back home. The system worked well for a very brief period of time, but I'll explain briefly why they didn't. This cheap, I mean, in lecturing about this device, I'm afraid, my democratic bully pulpit credentials start showing to my students, because it sounds like some sort of Reaganite utopia. Things will somehow trickle down, and you don't have any government. You have local notables serving in place of appointed officials, so that government expenses are kept at a very low amount, and things become, if you like, privatized, including this tax farming that's going on. This cheap pay-as-you-go tax farming system could not function, however, when the main capital was removed to Beijing. I mean, after all, how is a Liangjiang going to ride his horse all those hundreds of kilometers north, 1,000 kilometers? As monetization and the commercialization of the rural economy began to accelerate during the early 16th century. There were by then two very different manifestations of localism, and this is not, as you will hear, the localism that the evolutionists espouse. One was actually an urban phenomenon, not a rural phenomenon. The Ming founder had already, following Mongol precedents, enfeoffed his progeny, his sons, as princes of the blood, in cities throughout China, places like Kaifeng and Yanjing, Beijing, for the Prince of Yan, who of course became the Yongle Emperor, and so forth and so on. During the commercial revolution that began in the early 16th century, the Jiangnan metropolis of Suzhou overran its Yuan boundaries to become one of the largest cities in the world. I think that Marmay estimates that at its height, Suzhou, Sarah, correct me if I'm wrong, had about 1.5 million households. It was a huge city. I mean, if you think of a European scale where London, of a slightly later period, had 100,000 people, this is the kind of scale that Marco Polo had written about for essentially the southern Sung, which nobody back home believed to be possible, let alone true. During this commercial revolution, Suzhou then began to run over its regular city walls and formed a vast new urban conglomerate that actually incorporated the rural counties around it. So you have this urban sprawl, which lasted, by the way, until the 19th century and the unequal Treaty of Nanking, or the unequal treaties, which meant that Shanghai, of course being a sea harbor, became the main port and hence the main city of that region, so that on the sort of teeter-totter of history, Shanghai rose and Suzhou fell. But for all that period of time, that is for about 450 years, Suzhou was the major city of this rich area, an area which, by the way, a prefecture, the prefecture of that area around Suzhou provided 1/15 of the tax revenue of the entire empire. So you can see what a core of wealth it constituted from the point of view of fiscal managers dealing with taxes and similar questions. By the early 1600s, this new localism can be seen in the municipal riots of the Chongzhen period, when Suzhou's notables, that is the notability of the city, were capable of driving eunuch tax collectors from the central government out of the city's gates in the name of municipal rule. This is very short-lived, I have to say, because by the early 18th century, the Qing government had managed to divide and rule the city's population, pitting one class against another, and that kind of municipal cohesive solidarity began to come apart at the seams. Now, the second demonstration of localism accompanied the rise of the civil service gentry after 1450, when the Chinese states, when the Ming states' ladder of success, that is the regularly administered examinations, became virtually the only means of attaining regular government office. Until then, in other words, until the mid-15th century, there were several routes to government office. You could become an imperial university student. There were ways of attaining this through separate and special examinations. But after 1450, virtually the only way, other than being born a relative of the Ming house, to higher status in Ming society was by going and taking those district, provincial, and national examinations to get a higher degree. And that examination system, of course, will last all the way down to the turn of the 20th century. So again, we're talking about a long 450 years. Battening off high executive salaries, parenthetically again, we tend to underestimate the amount of income officials of rank 6 and above were getting under the Ming and later Qing dynasties. A provincial governor general, for example, under the Qing earned about 180,000 ounces of silver a year. I mean, it's not quite as extraordinary a distance as we enjoy in our big corporations as the CEOs enjoy in our big corporations today, but it still was a considerable gap between them and sub-bureaucrats running around the local county, conducting their own affairs. Living off of these high executive salaries, the shidaifu, the big gentry, and this again is based upon Japanese scholarship, not my own, began to displace the rich peasant tax chiefs, the liangjiang, by exploiting their own literati tax privileges to establish themselves as a local rentier class that thrived economically as central government revenues diminished. In fact, I would argue that it becomes increasingly difficult from the middle Ming years on to even distinguish between rural and urban gentry. This new so-called localism notwithstanding. It's very hard to determine primary place of residence, not to speak of the economic foundations of some of these very important big families. Efforts have been made in this direction, but as Professor Escher can tell you from his research many years ago on the urban reformist elite in the early 20th century in central Yangtze cities, he had a heck of a time establishing a strong and authoritative sense of where their social, rather their economic bases, their relations of production, if you like, were to be found. This new engrossment of the local gentry was thus not as much a continuation of Southern Sung localism as a reassertion of the new bureaucratic elite's privileges that grew after the Yuan because of the Ming's parsimony toward local government. From the 15th century on, Chinese bureaucracy, or district bureaucracy rather, was to remain relatively fixed, formally limited to a regularly appointed magistrate, an assistant magistrate, a jail warden, and a few lictors. Law clerks, accountants, and yamen runners, or policemen, were part of an informal layer of government at the county level that subsisted off of irregular and unofficial revenue, kickbacks, legal fees, tax adjustments, and outright peculation or extortion, which constituted the salaries of these sub-bureaucrats. Indeed, until a failed effort that Sarah's Professor Madeline Zellen did her original dissertation research on in the 1720s to actually set up a paid form of local government. With the exception of that, this form of informal local government was to last down until the end of the Qing Dynasty. It would be as though here in La Jolla, your police and all of the garbage collectors, of course, whatever passed for public health, people who ran the orphanages and so on, and law clerks, all had to charge people fees for public services, which they then pocketed and which never saw their way onto regular government books. At the provincial level, no one knew, in fact, what these local finances amounted to. Though periodically there were surveys and fake figures were reported in and so on. Although China's rural population grew dramatically during the 16th century, the political technology to rule all these subjects hardly changed to embrace new demands for social and political order. The result was an increase in the informal duties assumed by the rural gentry who served as legal mediators or pettifoggers, tax farmers, and even militia leaders. By the 17th century, this new practice of what was later taken to be gentry home rule was firmly embedded, especially in the central and southern portions of the empire. Ideally, in the writings of state craftsmen such as Gu Yanwu and Huang Zongxi, both of the 17th century, that was a potentially positive development. After all, who was better able to look after the welfare of a locale than its own residents, especially if one recognized the legitimate public benefits of their enlightened self-interest? Note that this was said or written at a time when both the Ming and the Qing are practicing something called the law of avoidance, which prohibits officials from serving in their own provinces so that they don't utilize or they don't mix up their private interest with the public common good or official good. The trouble was that idealized localism had led in the late Ming to such an engrossment of gentry privileges that neither society nor polity were served. The official degree-holding literati were legally exempt from corvée, or labor service, and during the 16th century, when a tax reform called the Single Whip Law, Bianfa, which merged service tax, or corvée, with the land tax, the fu, was implemented, the Shi were given exemptions from all forms of local taxation. As their names were removed from the tax rolls, the burden of imposts fell all the more heavily on simple freeholders. Unable to pay local taxes, peasants either fled their properties to join a million-large sea of human vagrants, the Liumin, who were to be seen flooding the highways of China during the late 1500s and early 1600s, and who were recognized by their by contemporary writers, who of course were educated literati, as constituting a new social crisis, a real social crisis. Or else they commended their lands, these peasants, and themselves as serfs. Serfdom was not outlawed until around 1730, to official gentry for shelter from the dynasty's tax collectors. Let me just quickly recap that. When tax reforms in the 16th century merged your corvée or labor duties with your land tax, the initial exemption from corvée, after all, who's going to make a literatus in his gown and long fingernails go out and dig a ditch? So he didn't have to do that. When that was merged with land tax into a single cash payment, you were exempted from all taxes if you happened to have a higher degree from the state examination system. And the poor blokes who didn't have them found that their own tax burdens increased. They either had to say, heck, I'm leaving this place and I'm going to go try to make my living off the land elsewhere, dalio, as we say in modern Chinese, or they commended themselves. They said, I'm going to toshan, I'm going to turn my body over to my local gentry landlord because he's got the tax exemptions. And in some cases, I'll agree to do labor service for him. In fact, it depended on where you were in China at this time, but there was a very, very hazy line between tenantry and serfdom. It was very difficult to distinguish this sometimes. The result from the dynasty's perspective was a disastrous loss of revenue that eventually impoverished the imperial treasury, making it impossible for Ming armies to survive other than on their own skills at foraging, to fight new enemies mustering to the north beyond the Great Wall. The turn toward localism, in other words, had in a distorted way supported the rise of a powerful landholding elite, buttressed by the privileges of state rank, which subjugated the peasantry and deprived the central government of revenues absolutely necessary for the defense of the empire by the turn of the 17th century. Anti-Mongol nativism, meanwhile, continued to impel Ming emperors to extirpate the Mongol menace. Though some Mongols, both officers and rank and file, ended up serving in Ming hereditary military forces, they remained as a group, as a tribal group, an ethnic and constant menace lingering on the borders of the empire. Always desiring trade with the Central Kingdom, they exchanged their horses, so much harder, swifter, and battle-wise than steeds bred in the ranches within the Great Wall, for Chinese tea and other emoluments, silk floss garments, tableware, metal tools, jewelry that were produced only in the Heavenly Kingdom. One of the ironies of this exchange, however, is that Ming Nativism, particularly its anti-Mongolism, inspired war hawks at court to criticize trade with the enemy. Bowing to these pressures, the court periodically closed these markets along the frontier, only to lose access to the war horses they needed, even as they alienated and affronted Mongol tribesmen who were almost inevitably driven to seize what they could not gain by commercial exchange. At the same time, Ming emperors sporadically pursued a vigorous policy of countering Mongol influence, sending or even leading their own expeditions beyond the Great Wall into barbarian territory. Sometimes their campaigns succeeding in driving out the visceral enemy, usually they failed. The Tumu incident in the mid-15th century, when the Mongols actually seized the Chinese emperor as hostage, and Anda's raids into North China a century later, where he rode under the high walls of Beijing, accentuated this sense of besiegement, although the supposedly ineffectual Wanli emperor had led forces of his own beyond the passes during the late 16th century. So as we now know more about Ming military history, we see that there's constant warfare with the Mongols, and this shifting back and forth between buy them off and get their horses, or fight them off and lose your troops, seems to have been another characteristic of the period as well. In this course, the function of the Great Wall changed. Originally, it was intended as a last-line defense against barbarians. The approach of the conquerors was supposed to be signaled by a kind of distant early warning system. From outposts and garrisons 50 to 100 kilometers beyond the Great Walls, major gates, and entry posts. In the interest of economy, however, many of these early warning posts were closed down. I mean, you didn't have anybody to ride back and say, hey, the Mongols are coming, and they're heading toward this portion of the wall, because there was nobody out there to report. They were all beginning to huddle behind the wall. I'll come back to that in just a minute. Before the officials could report their arrival, the Mongols could literally be on the doorstep of China. I mean, Beijing is only, by car, 3 hours at most, from the Great Wall, and certainly only 2 days' ride from the Great Wall by horse. Nevertheless, after the 1449 Tumu incident, the Chinese fell back upon themselves. Now, I was going to make an aside here on the Zhenghe voyages, with which you're all familiar. These are these famous voyages, these 7 voyages between 1406 and 1433, when these vast armadas, some of them carrying as many as 27,000 persons, sailed all the way to Mogadishu and the east coast of Africa. There's a current book that a naval submarine captain, I don't think he ever emerged from the depths, has written about their sailing on to America, and there's a lawyer in Peking who's flogging around a supposed map that uses modern longitudinal notations, which purports to be from that period, to prove that the Chinese discovered America, which plays to Chinese vanity. If you really believe this, most Chinese, well, in fact, I think every responsible Chinese historian in China has said this is just nonsense. But it is not what really, one as a historian hesitates to say really, but it's not what I think, let me put it that way, really happened. I mean, he did, the Zhenghe voyages did take Chinese, actually Muslim officials from China as far as Mecca, but they didn't get as far as Brazil. So I was going to go into all of this in great detail, but I'll skip over that since I'm sure you're familiar with. Again, sort of an aside, these voyages are terribly symbolic. In 1988, on the very eve of the Tiananmen massacre, there was a very popular television series in China called Heshang River Dirge, or River Elegy, which sets up the Zhenghe voyages as China's turn toward the Blue Sea, the maritime frontier. I mean, after all, 86 years before Columbus sails the ocean blue, there are the Chinese sailing at least the Indian Ocean blue. Though the coast, well, I won't get into that right now. But, and therefore, I used the French word repliement, the folding back of these maritime ambitions after the mid-15th century, and a turn inward is marked by many, including Chinese popular historical mentality, as representing a turn away from global history, world history, and presumably modernity. Now, those were thoughts of the 80s, not the 2000 aughts. So I wouldn't say that applies now, but the symbolic importance of these voyages can't be underestimated. I do say, however, here that the inland turn occurred at the very moment that China was also turning away from the Central Asian steppe. And this is what I was going to tell you about the Great Wall. The Great Wall that you see at Badaling today, which is the nearest one to Peking, for example, is markedly different in texture from what it was in the 14th century. It was a tamped earth wall. During the 15th century, as part of this new defensive and passively nativist attention to outsiders, including even Hideyoshi in the late 16th century, when he invaded Korea en route to China, never got there, Ming emperors decided to strengthen their fortification, which isn't keeping anybody out apparently, by covering the tamped earth edifice with kiln-dried bricks. It reminds one a little bit of the effort that Chairman Mao ordered to make bricks during the Vietnam War period. Everybody had a daily quota of bricks. And for somebody brought up in Shanghai, it was kind of hard to find the stuff to make the bricks with, but that's all right. A massive campaign was begun in North China at this time, in the late 16th century, to force the 15th century, to force the peasantry to provide these tiles or bricks, some of which had their names inscribed into the clay before they were fired, for refacing the Great Wall. So the masonry that you see is really a very late addition to a wall that began really back in the pre-Han period. Somehow that sums up for very well. What we have here is a Ming equivalent of the Maginot Line, an imaginary protection against external entry. I mean, you either ride around it, or you come up and you climb up the bricks and over it. But somehow that, for me, sums up very well the nature and the spirit of Ming Nativism. It was initially aggressive, driving out the first military ranks of the Mongols and sending naval expeditions all the way to Africa to announce a new period of Chinese rule, and then it became rigidly defensive, static, hidebound, and fearful. And this, in fact, was the situation when the second of these historical temblors struck the Central Plain, as the Manchus, Ruguan, entered the passes, entered the gates, and occupied the Central Plain in the summer of 1644. Now, this is not just a Chinese phenomenon, the trouble of those years. It's hard to fit continuities and mere transitions into demographic terms or demographic data when you consider that perhaps the Chinese population in the 17th century, due to the same combination of factors that Sarah mentioned, declined by maybe as much as 40%. In this case, the plague was not bubonic, but it was smallpox. The Earth was entering a period of global, not warming, but cooling. The temperature went down for nearly 60 years by about 3 degrees Celsius. Harvest days were shortened. Rivers froze over. Boyang Lake froze over, for instance. This, of course, is the picture we have from Defoe's description of the Thames freezing over. So it's a global phenomenon of cooling, which tends to drive the Manchus as a tribe in northeastern Asia onto the offensive, if only to feed themselves. First they conquer their tribal adversaries, then they intermarry with the Mongols and conquer some of the ones they can't get affiance to. They invade Korea, and finally they invade China. They invaded China on many occasions, but decisively in the summer of 1644. I won't go into any detail here about that invasion. I mentioned the haircutting order last time and the ethnic animadversion that this aroused. I simply want to say that the Manchus took 40 years to conquer China, but in the mid-60s invasion, their mid-60s and 1600s invasion was like this Mongol eruption that we have talked about 4 centuries earlier, another violent historical disruption. In some senses, Chinese history was never the same thereafter. But at this point also, the distinction between a particularistic nationalism and Confucian universalism became even murkier because of the confusion of the Chinese and the adeptness of the Manchus, especially when it came to adopting rulerly guises. When Doregon, the Prince Regent, the uncle Prince Regent, rode up to the Peking city wall in the late spring summer of 1644, he was greeted by the local officials who had come out to give him the keys to the city, but who mistakenly believed that he was a Chinese general who'd actually been defeated by Doregon and then joined forces with him. So when the caravan or the procession reaches the city walls and all these officials are out there with, bowing down to the new ruler and very obsequiously patting his horses behind, as they say. They said, "My God, look at him, he's got his head shaved." And they said, "Tanzi, Data, it's a Tartar." And then someone else said, no, it couldn't be the Tartar. It's the Ming emperor who was conquered at the Tumu incident who's come back, and which of course was sheer fantasy. But they couldn't explain it to themselves for a brief moment until Doregon began speaking to them in Mandarin that this man was a Manchu barbarian. But could a barbarian outsider to the central kingdom become an erstwhile universal emperor of China without losing his own particular sense of ethnic identity? How could he preserve, and the he here is a persona, it's emblematic, it's various embodiments of Qing emperors, how could he preserve that special sense of being Manchu without alienating and distancing his own Chinese subjects? And what of the latter's identity in turn? And I go back to my original question. Did universalistically pretentious culturalism actually prevent the Han Chinese from recognizing their own ethnic separateness? Much, much later, toward the end of the Qing dynasty, incipient nationalist revolutionaries found it even hard to think of themselves other than in familiar dynastic terms. When Zhang Taiyan, Zhang Binglin, was arrested by the police in Tokyo after Chinese students demonstrated against the Manchus in 1903, he was asked by the Meiji police what his nationality was. At that moment, Zhang could only think to answer that he was a subject of the Ming. And when Sun Yat-sen, the father of the country, came north to Beijing early in 1912 to celebrate the revolutionaries' victory over the Manchus, his first ceremonial act was to visit the Ming tombs west of the capital. There, he claimed that ethnic resistance to the Manchus had vanished among the upper classes after the Qing conquest, but that Han nationalism had been preserved among the lower orders, the people, the folk, who had led the Triad secret societies underground to, quote, overthrow the Qing and restore the Ming, unquote. This was, as I hope to show in my last lecture, not only a case of muddled history, it was also an expression of confused nationalism. Thank you.
Thank you.